Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a 2026 court judgment that honestly reads less like a dry legal document and way more like a financial thriller. We're unpacking a post-divorce property dispute that perfectly illustrates the hidden traps, the ticking clocks, and the logical mazes buried deep within civil law. If you've ever assumed a legal matter was closed just because some time has passed, you are definitely going to want to pay close attention to this one. Let's kick things off with a hypothetical. Imagine this. Your ex suddenly sells properties you thought you both owned, a full decade after you split up. Can you still swoop in and demand your share of the cash? Sounds like a simple yes or no question, right? Well, in the legal world, simple questions almost always have incredibly complex answers. So here's our roadmap for making sense of this dilemma. We'll look at the anatomy of the dispute, the timeline of events, the power of a previous judgment, whether the statute of limitations expired, the burden of proof, and finally, the court's ultimate verdict. All right, part 1, the anatomy of the property dispute. Basically, our introduction to the case and what's actually at stake here. Here's the setup. Naomi is suing her ex-husband, Adrian, for exactly 22,377 euros and 23 cents. Why? She wants half the value of an apartment and a garden that Adrian just sold. Now, these properties were bought while they were married, but, and this is a huge but, they were registered solely in Adrian's name. So Naomi is essentially trying to retroactively claim her financial cut of the pie. Moving on to part 2, the timeline of events. How exactly did we end up in this situation? This timeline is absolutely crucial to the whole story. Naomi and Adrian got divorced way back in 2012, but they completely skipped splitting up their assets. Big mistake, as we'll see. Fast forward to 2018, Naomi sues Adrian over separate property, and she mostly loses. Then, in 2022, Adrian decides to sell the apartment and the garden to third parties. That sale is the catalyst. It triggers Naomi to file her current lawsuit, which leads us straight to this 2026 ruling. We're talking about a 14-year saga finally coming to a head. Next up, part 3, the power of the previous judgment, or what lawyers like to call res judicata, the ghosts of the past. So Naomi banked almost her entire new lawsuit on one specific quote pulled right out of that 2018 trial. The judge back then literally wrote that the apartment and garden were considered property acquired jointly by the spouses. For Naomi, this looked like an absolute slam dunk. She figured this one sentence legally proved forever that the properties were joint assets. Case closed, right? Just write the check. Well, not so fast. The 2026 court stepped in with a brilliant counterargument. They had to draw a very strict line between establishing a concrete, undeniable fact, like, say, the exact date they got divorced, and a legal evaluation of facts. You see, a legal evaluation is just a judge's interpretation at that specific time, and it is definitely not locked in stone forever. And this is where things get really fascinating. The judge actually busts out some classic philosophy to explain this, the Aristotelian syllogism. It's a logical argument format. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The judge points out that calling it joint property in 2018 required that kind of logical deduction based on scattered evidence. Because it relied on logic and not a hard registration document, it was an evaluation, not an undeniable fact. Ultimately, Naomi tripped hard right out of the gate. The new judge ruled that those 2018 comments about joint property were just side motives, basically non-binding side notes. Since that older case was actually about Naomi trying to prove the properties were her separate personal assets, the judge's casual musings about them being joint property carried zero legal weight in 2026. She couldn't just lean on the past. She had to prove everything all over again. As if that wasn't stressful enough, we hit part 4. Has the statute of limitations expired? Basically, the ticking clock. Adrian's defense team went straight for the calendar on this one. They argued that civil law has a strict 10-year time limit. Since the divorce was in 2012, and we're way past 2022, they said Naomi was entirely out of time. But Naomi's defense shot back. They claimed the clock only reset when the properties were actually sold. So the whole thing hinged on one core legal question. When did the violation of her rights actually happen? In a really surprising twist, the court actually sided with Naomi here. The judge decided that while the exes were just sitting on the properties, her rights weren't being violated. The clock only started ticking when she suffered a real financial loss, which happened the exact moment Adrian officially sold the properties in 2022. So her lawsuit was actually perfectly on time. So she cleared the ticking clock hurdle, but now she's facing part 5, which is undoubtedly the hardest obstacle: the burden of proof, the evidence trap. Because that 2018 judgment wasn't the golden ticket she thought it was, Naomi had to start entirely from scratch. To legally prove this was joint property, she had to follow 3 specific steps. First, prove it was bought during the marriage, which was easy enough. But then, she had to prove it was acquired using mutual funds, or, alternatively, through her physical help and labor. And unfortunately for Naomi, here is where the entire case just completely falls apart. She couldn't provide any new evidence of her financial contributions. I mean, think about it. Because so much time had passed since the marriage ended, she couldn't dig up old bank statements, receipts, or any concrete proof of where the money actually came from. She had bet everything on that dismissed 2018 quote. Without fresh evidence, her case just collapsed right at the finish line. Which brings us to our final section, part 6, the court's final verdict. Let's see the actual financial outcome. The court's logical progression is pretty brutal but complete. Without hard proof that it was joint property, the entire foundation for Naomi's compensation just vanishes into thin air. The judge officially and completely rejected her claim. So Adrian legally owes her absolutely zero compensation for the properties he sold. But you know what? It actually gets worse. Instead of walking away with her expected 22,000 euros, the court ordered Naomi to pay over 1,000 euros out of her own pocket. Because she lost the case, the law requires her to cover Adrian's legal defense fees as well as the state's processing costs. She went in hoping for a massive payout and left with nothing but a bill. This leaves us with a really critical and honestly sobering takeaway. Are you absolutely sure your past legal ties are fully severed? Naomi assumed a past judge's passing comment was an ironclad guarantee, and it turned into a very expensive lesson. Whether you're dealing with a divorce, a business partnership, or an old contract, assuming the past will magically protect you in the future is a really dangerous game. So tell me, are your own legal loose ends truly tied up? One decision changed everything. Watch the next case right here, and subscribe for more real stories.